Okay, topic 1.2, second subtopic of the first topic. GDP is so important in economics that it's worthwhile having another look at it. I know we've already distinguished between real GDP and nominal GDP, and a lot of the first part of this slide just reinforces the difference between nominal and real GDP. Just keep in mind, nominal GDP is a biased measure of GDP because it incorporates price changes, whereas we only want a measure of GDP that reflects changes in the volume of output, and that is real GDP. So GDP is important to economists because we very often talk about periods of economic expansion where an economy is growing strongly, and we'll use GDP as a measure of the growth in the size of the economy. So during expansion phases, GDP is typically rising. During contraction phases, GDP is typically growing. GDP is growing very slowly, and during recessions, GDP is actually falling. In fact, a recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth in real GDP. So there's certainly been a lot of recessions around the world recently. The GFC caused a recession in many economies around the world. So that GFC is the global financial crisis. And then more recently, the COVID pandemic of 2020 caused recessions in numerous countries around the world. So before we talk about recessions and what's going on in the world, it's useful to really get a good grasp on what GDP is. So we know that real GDP is the measure that we're interested in, but how do you actually measure real GDP? Well, first of all, you keep the price constant over time, but GDP is typically measured in one of 3 ways. Now, we're not going to get bogged down in all of the different ways GDP can measure, because in this course, we're only interested in what GDP is, not in how it is measured. So I'm just going to go through this quickly and give you one way that GDP is measured. So GDP can be measured by adding up all of the spending on final goods and services in Australia over the period of 1 year. So that $20 you spent on a meal at a restaurant when you went out recently, that would be $20 counted towards Australia's GDP. And then maybe you went on a holiday down to Margaret River, for example, and spent $500 down there. That would be $500 worth of GDP as well. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics adds up all of these sorts of transactions and comes up with a total value of all final goods and services produced. So in that example, one going out to a restaurant, I guess you would have the value, it would actually be both a good and a service, wouldn't it? Because you would have a good in terms of the food you ate, but the service would actually be the preparation of the food and the service that you received from the people serving you at the restaurant. A holiday down to Margaret River, that's probably more of a service. I'm thinking more accommodation, that sort of thing. So it all contributes towards GDP. Now in economics, one way of measuring GDP is adding up all of the value of all of the spending on Australian goods and services that takes place. And what the ABS does and what economists do, this is the way economists think, is we break up spending into 4 different categories. So consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net export spending, which is exports minus imports. Now, every dollar or every transaction that is undertaken in the Australian economy is classified as either C, I, G, or NX. So let's consider consumption spending. That is you going out and purchasing that meal at a restaurant, getting a haircut, buying a pair of shoes, any type of consumption spending. And consumption spending is typically undertaken by households. Investment expenditure, that could be you investing in a house. It could be a company building a railway from a mine site to the coast, where they then ship their commodities up to Asia. A lot of different examples of investment. Government expenditure, that is just money spent by the government. And net exports, that is expenditure typically by foreigners on Australian exports. And Australia, we all know, exports things like iron ore, coal, natural gas, various agricultural commodities. Education is a big export. Tourism is a big export as well. And all of those exports are purchased using Australian dollars, typically by foreigners. So what the ABS does is it doesn't add up every single transaction that takes place in Australia, but it's got ways of estimating what total consumption spending is, what total investment expenditure is, et cetera, and then they add all of those expenditures together and come up with what we call aggregate or total expenditure, which is then used as an estimate of GDP. Okay, now it's worthwhile reading up on this and sort of reinforcing in your own mind exactly what GDP is and how this expenditure method can be used to estimate GDP. But a couple of things that the textbooks typically don't mention. Now, investment expenditure. That is expenditure on investment equipment. Or think of it this way, expenditure on capital equipment. If you're a business, or perhaps if you're an individual household, it could be expenditure on maybe a house, or perhaps a small truck if you've got a landscaping business. Okay, so think of it as generally spending on an Australian investment good or a capital good. So of course, if you buy a piece of machinery from Germany, that is investment expenditure, but it's not investment expenditure on Australian capital equipment, an Australian good or services, so it's not counted in Australian GDP. And a lot of people do get confused by this word investment. They think, well, if I buy something like a share in BHP, then that's investment expenditure. Yes, it is in a sense, in the way that very often the average Australian uses the word investment. I agree with you, but it's not investment expenditure in the sense that the word is used in this context. Because when you purchase a share from BHP, that is personal investment. You're investing and hoping to get a return, but it's not investment in this sense. Because when you buy a share from issued by BHP, what are you actually doing? Yes, you're buying a share of the company, you're buying part of the company, but you're actually providing your funds to BHP. So then they take the funds from that share purchase and then they undertake investment expenditure in new railways, new ships, new capital equipment on their mine sites. So think of it this way. In this context, investment expenditure creates GDP. It creates, it's the purchase of a final good or service. And you buying a share is not a final good or service. It's a financial product. Okay, so we're going to be very careful about what we mean by investment in this context. Of course, we will be talking about investing in shares and bonds in this course and other sorts of financial assets. But this type of investment here on this slide is a very different type of investment. It's a type of expenditure. Investment is a type of expenditure on, just think of it in terms of capital equipment. Something that will help you produce goods and services. Of course, yes, housing investment, we sort of include that in I, but most investment expenditure is on capital equipment, and that capital equipment is then used to produce goods and services. So C, I, G, and NX. Some of you may be wondering why imports are actually subtracted out from net exports. Have a read up on it, but it's quite straightforward actually. Let's just imagine, it's just the way we subtract imports because of the way that the Australian Bureau of Statistics in Canberra classifies different transactions in these categories. So for example, if you buy a $500 pair of Italian shoes, then that will be classified as an import. And so imports will go up by $500. At the same time, that is consumption spending. So the $500 will be included in consumption spending. So your purchase of that $500 pair of shoes will increase consumption spending by $500. It'll increase this variable M by $500. But because M is subtracted, those two entries will cancel each other out. And so the purchase of the $500 pair of shoes won't be included in Australian GDP. Of course, if there's any retail margin, which there likely will be, if there's any retail margin, which is profit to the Australian shop that sells those shoes, that'll be included in Australia's GDP, but not the value of the shoes themselves. So that's why imports are generally subtracted. If you import a piece of capital equipment, if you're a business, you import a piece of capital equipment from Germany worth $10,000, then that $10,000 will be included under investment expenditure, but then it'll be subtracted when it is that $10,000 is included in the variable M, imports. So once again, the piece of capital equipment from Germany, it's not an Australian final good or service, so it's not included in Australian GDP, but it is included in the in two categories here. It's just I and M, but it just cancels out. Okay, so that's GDP. Just keep in mind that C, I, G, and NX, they're categories of expenditure on Australian goods and services only. And so if we want a measure of how much output is produced in the Australian economy over the course of 12 months, we can measure the total value of spending on that output over the same period of time. And the total value of spending on that output over that period of time is a very good estimate of the actual the actual amount of GDP produced. Okay, so just keep in mind, we have just looking at what we call the expenditure method of estimating GDP. And we are, through the ABS, they're helping us do this. We are adding up all of the spending, we're classifying all of the spending on Australian goods and services, and then we're adding up the four categories to obtain an estimate of GDP. Okay, so GDP can be estimated by how much we spend in a year on final goods and services.